Here is a graphic of a typical three-dimensional space. It is a free-to-use graphic. This is easily usable as a training room for three-dimensional spatial memory. I have faded the space slightly just to show you how the spatial element is established in your mind, in 3 dimensions. Try to get an impression of the way that a 3-dimensional space looks. This may help. I have added a grid. Next slide please. If you need it broken down further, if you want to do this yourself in a graphics package, line up a vector graphic. Here it is trimmed, but I will show you the original. Next slide. Add in the floor. And the next slide. You can imagine this as a black space or as a white space. Next slide. Thanks. Here is the slide a little less faded. Next slide. There you have a final grid. And the next slide. You can then take away the building and imagine any room from this viewpoint. Next slide. Adding color into the space can help, as you humans are very color-based creatures. Next slide. Colored lines, walls, background images. And the next slide. Please. Number 11, I believe. In your mind you may wish to use color as a reminder of the position of a room in a long list of memory palaces. One technique which is too advanced to discuss here is to use a hierarchy of colors to designate a room. For example, here the background is green, which for me would mean that this would be the 4th room in a series, green being the 4th color of the rainbow. Red, orange, yellow, green. Next slide. One of our number here in the Brotherhood is a fan of something called Star Trek, and he always imagines his rooms as being generated by a Star Trek holodeck program. Whatever that may be. Next slide. Here you see the background being imagined as green. This is being done in a simple free graphics program, but what we want you to concentrate on is being able to see the steps and imagine them in your mind. And the next slide. If it were purple, that's the same as violet. It would be number 6. Next slide. If yellow, number 2, and here I have unfaded the original. Next slide. While this image is a little more advanced, you can imagine yourself or someone else seeing it from the other side. This can help, especially if you work on being able to have your mind's eye fly through the air. And the next slide. So the point I am trying to make is imagine the space you wish to remember as being in 3 dimensions. Floor, back wall and side wall is a good way to practice. Next slide. Add them in. Next slide. Oops, sorry about that. I must have inadvertently put an image from my idiots I want to avoid into the wrong folder. Mwahahaha. And the next slide. Number 20. Here is the entire floor, walls and floor grid. There is nothing special about this, or the measurements. Give me the next slide please. Remember, however, as you see here, to always orientate in your mind the actual angles of the picture you have in your mind. Here is a picture of my home, prior to its restoration. Miss Doolally, can I have the next slide please? Number 22. Another great exercise is for you to draw a two-dimensional map on paper, and then practice seeing it in 3 dimensions. Here's one I call Chambers. It has 12 rooms. Next slide please. When laid out on the floor, it does not look quite right. You must in this case play with the image in your mind. Next slide. Here's a room I liked the look of from a website. This is a screenshot. And the next slide. Number 25. Here you see how to imagine this room being used as a 3-dimensional space for spatial memory. Next slide. Remember what I advised. See the room as a grid, starting with the back wall. Next slide. Side walls and the next slide. And floor. Next slide. Number 29. Let me now take away the room for a second and place something to remember in the space. Here is a piano player. Next slide. Please. To get the figure absolutely clear in your mind, and using the spatial awareness of your incredible mind, you float the picture into the space. Next slide. Get it somewhere comfortable, where is up to you. Next slide. Settle the size in your mind. If you want it big, make it big. If you want it small, make it small. There are no rules.